Hey there, SCP fans. My name is Grigori Karpin, and this is Simply Creative People, the show about SCP creatives, be they authors, artists, or offsite content creators like YouTube and TikTok. We're focused on bridging the gap between various fans and serving as an introduction to different concepts and stories on the wiki. So, many welcomes to all, and let's get started. Alright, welcome to episode 7 of Simply Creative People. I'm Grigori Karpin, and I'm joined by...
I am allegedly Harry Blank.
The joke will never get old. And we have a guest as well this week. And you want to introduce yourself?
I am Marcellus Rains, known as Mars, the most famous unknown author on the wiki.
Hail Caesar!
That's right. You were the author that did the that fun duology for the Fifthism episode that we talked about.
Yeah.
Yes, I am.
All right, we're going to get that enthusiasm.
Go lay down.
So,
it takes a lot to really get Mars going. Mars is one of the most even-keeled people we have.
and
I appreciate that.
I appreciate it as well.
So, like we've been doing in every episode since we've been doing this current set, I've been liking to do this little creative corner where we talk about our own processes, and you know, when we get somebody on that's doing other things than writing, we'll talk to them about that. But seeing as how we're all authors, we thought we would talk a little bit about adapting ideas, because the wiki is a collaborative forum, of course, and we often will take concepts or characters or ideas from other established articles and then adapt them for use in our work. So, Mars, you want to go first? You're our guest.
Sure. In an article I wrote, Totally Not Porn, it follows two people from AWCY, and they're just these two guys that are just trying to make rent. And usually AWCY, at least as far as I've seen written on the wiki, they're typically non-violent. They just create art just to like freak people out. But in Totally Not Porn, one of the guys is like a complete and utter psychopath. Like, he decapitated 7 people just to make an art project to sell so that he can make rent for the month. And his friend's totally like completely against it. He's like, why'd you do this? Like, that's completely unhinged. And he's like, no, it's fine. We're gonna be.
It's
art,
art, man. It's art.
Rent's good.
Decapitation for decapitation's sake, am I right?
Yeah, pretty much. And, you know, vaporization and all that. That's another thing I introduced there, where it's like he erased the identities of the people so that no one could track him, because, you know, I mean, you can't just go around decapitating 7 people without consequence. At least I don't think you can. I've never tried, so I don't know.
One hopes not.
So when you were doing that, did you do like research? So just to clarify, AWCY, are we cool yet?
Did you do research? That's a great...
No, well, I just want to know, like...
How did you get into the headspace of decapitation? Alright, go ahead, Grigori.
I went out practice.
No. Well, I was just saying that AWCY is Are We Cool Yet, which is a different GUI, which we'll cover at some point, and they mostly are... You know, you characterize them as not that violent, but honestly, there's a bunch of articles where they do, like, weird art things that end up in, like, chaos or, like, death, and they're just, like, trying to make this, like, very, like, look-down-your-nose point to the grand society.
Yes. They're called anomalous artists or anartists.
Right. So did you, Mars, when you were... you know, working on that idea, did you read some other Are We Cool Yet stuff?
Yeah, I read through pretty much, if not the entire hub, before I started writing that, because I thought they were really cool, and I wanted to, you know, find out more about them before I started to write about the GOI. I didn't want to write about something that I knew next to nothing about, you know.
Yeah, that is always the difficult thing. So when you were adapting the idea, did you know, like, what was your process? When
I was writing that particular article, in addition to reading, like, the AWCY stuff, I also was reading a, I forget what it was. I was reading some other kind of book that was just talking about this, like, off-the-rails kind of, like, art interpretation and everything. So when I was adapting that into the Totally Not Porn article, I I decided that I also wanted to go off the rails with the Ann artists and just make them as different as I could to everything else that I had read up to that point, which included a lot of like ultra violence and decapitation.
Well, I mean, that's certainly not the first thing I imagine when it comes to art.
Yeah, well, it's a sensible thing to do, though, is if you look and see what's there, one of the best ways to make an addition is to write something that is definitely not already there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, especially with the way that the wiki works and how many things have already been covered. It is funny how often people I feel like when I talk to new authors, they'll be like, oh, every idea has been done. And it's like, not really. What are you looking at? Like, what is it a GOI? Is it a certain tone or something? Look at what's already been done, and trust me, there's an angle you haven't covered yet. Even if there is a similar anomaly or a similar article at its core, what kind of tone could you make? Instead of making this about a bunch of stuffy artists, Mars, you made it about, essentially like somebody looking for an excuse to pay rent by becoming a serial killer.
Yeah.
I've got a fairly obvious one for anybody who's read some of the stuff that I've done that is not part of my canon. I did some writing during the Canon Renaissance contest for the Resurrection canon.
What's that?
What is that? Grigori's never heard of this before. Nope. He's only written a dozen or so articles in it. It's a sort of restarting of the old 2008, 2010 storyline of the old author avatars trying to work within the Foundation as the Foundation considers using anomalies for aggressive use, making a mobile task force of anomalies. And each author generally contributes stories about the various author avatars and the various cool characters that have been established over the early years, and Resurrection brings that back, but also introduces new characters and the stuff that's happened in the intervening decade, and moves the story forward a bit. And the Canon Renaissance contest was supposed to be, let's all pick up a canon that hasn't been touched fairly recently, and Resurrection hadn't, so we took that, and while we were considering what our plot was going to be, I was sitting here like, what do I like from Series 1 that never came up again? Is there something? And what came up in my mind was SCP-096, which the internet has largely misunderstood. Fight me, bro. It's a misunderstanding. Misunderstood to be a story about a scary monster, which it's not. It's a story about how scary it is that one of the doctors hates this monster so much he's willing to cause multiple people to die horribly in a fake containment breach, just so the Foundation sees how dangerous this monster is and lets him get rid of it. And that story is written by Dr. Dan, who only wrote 096 and its 2 supplements, and he uses his author avatar, Dr. Dan, in that story. And then Dr. Dan is supposedly slated for execution for his crime at the end of the story and never gets touched by anything ever again on the wiki, period, for a decade. And I went, you know what? I'm just going to hijack this dude's author avatar, and I'm going to use him as a character. And I reread the articles several times. I got a sense of the vibe of what he was like, and I went, what if he didn't get killed off? What would he have been doing for the past 10 years? And how might we use him to tell more interesting stories going forward? And it's gotten to the point where I've used Dr. Dan enough, and other people, including Grigori, have used Dr. Dan enough that he qualified for a tag in our navigation system, because he's now a character beyond just 096. And you can just take these little things that other people have written that interest you and see whether or not they've actually been extrapolated into anything. And if they haven't, go nuts. And what it's led to is Grigori and I are now writing a Resurrection canon series, which is separate from the existing Resurrection, because it's kind of like a closed group of tale series sort of thing. But we're writing our own whole mythology using these characters, because it's actually a lot of fun to take stuff that you like that hasn't been taken up and be the person who makes use out of it.
Yeah, there's 2 things that I really liked about the way that you wrote Dr. Dan in a unique way from the way he was originally done, which, one, everything that he was involved in was incredibly grounded. He was using his brain, trying to solve problems, even if they dealt with like crazy anomalous stuff, but you didn't turn him into like some swashbuckling hero. But what you did do, which I think is so brilliant, and I don't think from 96 or the supplements it's really quite as obvious as the way that you do it. You turned him into that classic mad bastard character. The guy who knows better than everybody else in the room, is smarter than everyone else, and is a smart ass enough to point it out in funny ways.
Yeah, that was just the extrapolation, was he decided, independently of anybody else other than his research colleague, that this was such a big problem he was willing to get people killed and stage an event just to fix. And I extrapolated from that to be, this is a guy who has no doubt that he is the smartest person in the room. And what would it be like 10 years later, after he'd had to deal with having been wrong about that, to come back to work at the Foundation, knowing for a fact that he got people killed, but still wanting to prove he had reasons. So it's a gray area, and that's what's always fun with characters.
Yeah, and, as you said, I've also, because we did this joint thing now, written some Dr. Dan. The thing I think I like the most about him is this perfect balance between knowing he's the smartest guy in the room and he can probably think of a solution to most problems, but also balancing the fact that he is just plagued by the sins of his past. And I mean, he's not going to sit there and open up and have a teary heart-to-heart with somebody, but it's always there in the background that he knows he got a baby killed and a family killed and a bunch of soldiers killed just to prove a point.
And that's one of the fun things about using these old established characters, is playing back on their history and finding a new spin on it, which, as we'll probably talk about later with the White Ashes, is something that Mars did as well.
Yeah. So for myself, also similarly, though not connected to Resurrection, I have recently taken up a sort of buddy cop comedy, not exactly comedy series, using two fairly established older characters, one being Dr. Cleff, who is such a famous SCP character, and quite an overdone one in many ways, in my opinion. He's always portrayed sort of a very cartoonishly sexist, cartoonishly ignorant. It's surprising that he even has a doctorate. He seems like such a buffoon in some ways, and always carrying a shotgun because he likes shooting things. And Karsus Varus, who is the sort of central focus of SCP-2075, and he is essentially, if you're familiar at all with the Sarcasm, the Karsus are the leaders / priests / prophets, and they all have their own unique spin on incredibly powerful body horror type stuff going on. Varus's specific thing is that he can like sort of infect people to become extensions of himself. They still look like themselves, but he's in control. He's like the ultimate puppet master. And when we did 6500, I used both these characters towards the end to set up Vanguard, which was going to be this whole sea change in the way that the Foundation worked. And I thought, what better way to do that than to bring Cleff in and make him the butt of some jokes. And then also this Karsus, who's, when last we saw him in 2075, he's, on the loose and is like incredibly dangerous. Well, what if I transformed him into this, fairly statesman-like, because he's a leader? And somebody on Reddit, as a joke, went, you should do a buddy cop comedy with Cleff and Varus. And the minute someone said that, I was like, you're right. I have to do that. And that's turned into this whole series of Cleff and Varus dealing with dangerous Sarkic stuff that has been left mostly untouched on the wiki since they'd originally been writing. But the fun thing about both of these characters, the way that I adapted them, was I really tried to keep it true to their core, but then just dialed it back slightly for both of them. Like, Cleff is sort of a blustery, sometimes seemingly ignorant thing. I think one of his first lines is responded to by Varus in the first tale by, "Oh good, the racism starts." Because Cleff is such like an idiot who just says what's on his head, and he's not really that PC. And Varus, instead of being this arch evil sort of mysterious dude, is now like a bit more restrained, is very threatening in some ways, but is also like interested in being, a Karsus, a leader, etc. And putting them in these situations in which they are forced to work together, but then also sort of slightly begrudgingly start enjoying each other's company, has been so much fun. And that, neither of these characters were mine to begin with. And like you said, the funnest thing about it is taking established histories, which I've referenced several times with Cleff, and then using that as a plot point or as just a thing in a conversation that like adds a little bit of character depth to them.
It's also an amazing series, just by the way.
Thank you.
It is. I agree.
If the contest wasn't going on right now, I already have plans for the next 2 follow-ups, and I really need to do those.
It's always good to have more on the brain. Just one quick thing about that. The old author avatars for the people whose authors are no longer on the wiki, really, have become stock characters. There are things that you can pick up. You can figure them out pretty quickly just by the process of joining the site. You learn about these people because they're ubiquitous in the early stuff. And then you can just sort of use them as stock characters, which I think is kind of funny considering how they're outgrowths of the personalities of the people who helped create the site. If you need somebody who's an ignorant jerk and works at the Foundation nevertheless, and you don't want anybody questioning it, you can just plug Cleff in and they'll go, yeah, okay.
Yeah, I mean, what's so funny is I only threw him into Emissary, which is the path of the 6500 that we introduced Vanguard through. I only brought him in as a joke to be the, like, perfect personification of the old-fashioned Foundation stuff, because this was a story about how they were going to turn a new leaf. And by forcing myself to write him, because I can't stand writing caricatures specifically, like I can't stand, I would never be able to write fan fiction about Master Chief. Like, I'm not interested in writing that because I would have to like discuss some sort of much more interesting nuance to a character. That's not to say everything I write is deep. It's just I need to make the characters like somewhat more human, somewhat more believable, even if they are at their core still the ridiculous, racist idiot that Cleff is. And just by working through organic conversations between the two characters and then the situations I put them in, I've actually like started really bonding with this character that I swear I had very little respect for earlier on. I think I told you after I wrote the first one, Harry, I think I told you, I'm like, I think I like really enjoy writing Cleff, and you were like, you really got his voice down. I'm surprised.
Yeah, it's a thing that happens. It happened to me too. I've used Cleff a little bit as well, and it's like, this is kind of fun to write. I can see why Cleff did this.
Yeah, he is actually kind of, like if you, and again, like the way that what I always aim for is I start off in my head of thinking of the tropey use of Cleff in the past. That one famous story is he went and talked to SCP-682, was a thing that could kill anything, and they both just kind of stared at each other because that's how dangerous Cleff is. And it's just like, God, shut up. But, if you take that...
Chuck Norris joke.
Right, exactly. You take that and you just, like, dial it back a little bit and make the people around him think, they think he's just as ridiculous as many of the current authors think that the character is. Then it plays into something interesting. Like, you are a dinosaur. Why are you still around? And then you can mess with, different ideas there.
And Resurrection does that as well. They acknowledge that, so yeah.
Yeah, that's the fun thing about Resurrection. I know that like it's been sort of a controversial canon in some ways, and I get why, because it's sort of hearkening back to like an older age of the SCP stuff. But the thing that's most fun about it to me is taking these tropey characters and turning them into like actually fleshed out people.
Yeah.
Like because I also wrote for Canon Renaissance Resurrection for a different storyline that we then kind of conjoined for our new stuff. And we both used for a little bit Dr. Light, who is a famous, kind of withdrawn researcher type character avatar. And I've just grown to like absolutely love her for the same reasons. And I mean, I thought I would talk a little bit about the Deva, but honestly, we're going to have to do a whole episode on the Deva at some point. So just, a little bit behind the scenes, I basically took an entire GOI and transformed it into something else.
Yes, you did.
Which was weird.
I think it's a lot better now.
Thanks.
Yes.
I always loved it. Like, I read 140 pretty early on, and I've always gone... It's, like, probably the article other than 2840 that I've read the most. Like, I just think 140 has got so much narrative potential to it. And I was working on something with Pentagon, which just came out, called In the Carpathians, which was like a creepypasta dealing with the Deva. And I was doing research about the Deva articles, and I was like, there's no hub, there's no central like concept going on here, and each anomaly is sort of the self-contained thing. It would be really cool if somebody did that. And then I just started doing it, which you can do on the wiki.
You can always be the change you want to see on the wiki, and I think that's one of the most alluring factors of joining this community is like, you could take anything that's already established and write something that's completely against every established headcanon. And if you do it well, it works. And people will start to change how they feel or change how they see certain characters, like you've done with Cleff and Varus and Dr. Dan in Resurrection. And I think that's really cool.
Yeah, that's certainly, the word collaborative gets thrown around a lot, and, a lot of people think, oh, that means you can work with other people, which it does, and we should, and I've had a lot of good experience with Harry and other people doing that. But there's also that concept that you just said, like, you can just take things, as long as you're respectful to the original core material, even if what you're doing is totally different. If you show that you appreciate the core concept and aren't just like shitting on it, I think that it's like it's just a useful exercise for a writer, but it also has led to some really excellent stories. One of my favorite 6,000 entries was 6140, which was a complete 180 about the Deva, and it completely sort of threw sand in the face of the whole concept but they did it in such a masterful and smart fake out way that I just think it's brilliant.
Well, and today's subject is actually a really good topic for this reimagining thing, because the Broken God has been the subject of how many 001s and how many KCON entries now?
Yeah.
More than any other single topic?
Probably. I mean, it's. I don't know if it is actually the oldest GOI on the website, but I think it is one of them. I think it probably is actually the oldest.
I mean, it dates back to 2008, so...
Right, yeah.
That's the start.
So yeah, that's what we're talking about today. We're going to talk about the Church of the Broken God, which is this classic, megalith of lore on the wiki, and because of that, it's going to be a wide-ranging subject, and we're not going to talk about every single thing. It's impossible, honestly. We'll have to come back and talk about individual stories. And
looking at the outline, it looks as though you still made an attempt to fit every single thing on there. There's what, 24 things on this outline?
Yeah,
sorry for dropping like 100 articles on you.
Yeah, and that was like half of what Mars gave me. Which is funny because like normally I've been really, reliant on myself, looking through a hub, but then also, reaching out on Twitter and getting suggestions and whatnot. And basically I didn't have to do almost any of that because Mars was just like, here's some articles you need to read. And I included most of them. Well, no, probably about half, but and I included some of my own that I wanted to include, or not my own personal, but ones that I thought were important.
Yeah.
But yeah,
I was just like,
go ahead.
I was just like, here's everything that's important to any degree to get to understand this group of interests.
Yeah, it's good stuff. As we brought up last time, GOI formats are not always the most respected, and I think oftentimes I sort of discount them sometimes. Like I want to read Tales and I want to read SCPs. More often than not, I want to read Tales. But here, if you hadn't suggested these GOI formats, I probably would have looked at them. But because you were like, here, you got to hit these, I got a real interesting insight into they're just pure world building. As opposed to many other GOI formats, these are all like holy text. It's really great.
And they're a really good format. I like the Maxwell's GOI format a lot.
Yeah, a little bit. When you first open it up, I think it's a little bit hard to tell what it is. But yeah, once you just like kind of stare at it for a bit. But before we go into like specific articles, let's talk about some very general stuff. So, the Church of the Broken God is a very old religion. Sometimes, it seemed like it goes earlier than ancient Greece. There's even some relationship to like all the way back to ancient China. And basically, it centers around the worship of mechanization and believes that flesh and life to be inherently evil or broken, meaning like organic. The central to their theology is that their deity has been scattered, dispersed, or otherwise rendered inert, quote-unquote, broken God. That God is referred to in many different ways, from the Broken One to the Broken God to Mechane to Wan. The one I probably like the most is Mechane, but everyone can have their own opinions. But Mechane was originally a god that like kind of oversaw like design and like organized thought, etc. And it was a being that existed either in parallel or in some way relationship to Yaldabaoth, who is the god of like sarcasm, but it's not really the god of sarcasm, which I had to constantly explain. But basically, in a fight to the death, Mechane held back Yaldabaoth from the physical plane to protect humanity, and was broken apart. The history and origins of the belief are hard to nail down because their ancient and contemporaries are both ancient Davites and the Sarkic empires. It's clear that there was also a war between the ancient Mechanites and the Nalkin or the Sarkist forces in the Mediterranean around the 11th century BCE. It depends on which article you read, but it's often considered that the Mechanite Empire was victorious, but was kind of fell apart because of it. It was a Pyrrhic victory. This religion, as opposed to the Davites, has existed all the way until today, and there's basically 3 separate sects, and I thought we could each take one of them to talk about and then kind of move on from there. So let's see, the main one, the sort of centrist established quote-unquote Catholic version of the Broken God is called the Broken Church, which has been led by a man called Robert Bumaro. The Hub says it's since 1946, but lots of articles have implied that he's been around for much longer than that. The vast majority of material on the site is focused on this group. They're the earliest stuff created by Dr. Gears. They're sort of the mainstream. And the Hub says that there's something like 300,000 believers worldwide, which is still pretty small compared to mainstream religions, but when it comes to GOIs, that's a significant amount of people. And then a quote from the Hub says, through the use of often anomalous technology, church followers seek to bring together components of the body of God, thereby allowing the divine a physical form to utilize and bring about some sort of techno-organic apotheosis. That word always gets me in trouble. And basically, so they're trying to, their whole goal is to physically put together their god, because their god is a god of machines, and so if they can just find all the pieces or recreate them, then they could bring their god back and then rise up all of humanity. But there's been several splits in the last 100 years or so, and one of them is the Cogwork Orthodoxy. Harry, you want to read something about that?
Yeah, sure. So the Cogwork Orthodoxy is closer to the basic Church of the Broken God than is the third option that presumably Mars is going to be talking about in a minute. They're closer, but they're still separate because they have this weird steampunk industrial revolution aesthetic. They have a sort of a religious sense of analog as opposed to digital, steam, gears and cogs and clockwork sort of stuff. They have physical implants more commonly and more obvious and more overt. They're kind of the slightly more Luddite in the sense of not being into the whole internet stuff that the Maxwellists are really into. They don't like electronic devices at all, and they're really into experiencing this steampunk aesthetic as a sort of a religious expression. And I believe the leader of that particular sect is Legate Trunnion, but I could be wrong about that because this is not my area of expertise, but I'm fairly sure.
Yeah.
No, you had it right.
Yeah, so she's like the leader in the articles, but there is implications that there is like a patriarchy, which
Right.
is an interesting term to choose, obviously written by a dude, that is sort of the handing down of the Orthodox truths. They're the ones that figure out what their holy writ is. And I think you almost undersold it because they're so against electronic or digital stuff that they think it's heresy. It's an abomination to use digital technology.
Right. The three groups don't get along very well, although there is a tale that we're looking at where they appear to, but yeah.
Yeah. They're highly centralized and regulated by a group of unknown composition. Like I said, they're called the patriarchs, and they really focus on this thing called standardization, which is where everything mechanical or human being augmented by the mechanical will reach, a standard level of design quality, whereby the adherents submit to anomalous mechanical enhancement with the stated goal of remaking themselves in the image of their deity. So they're less focused on rebuilding God, although I'm sure if offered the chance, they would certainly take part in it, and certainly some articles have them talk about it. But we've left I think one of the more interesting ones for Mars, because Mars, you've written sort of a lot about Maximalism, so why don't you kind of give your own thoughts on it?
Yeah, so the Church of Maximalism, they represent a more modernized, computer-focused, like, electronic-focused version of the Broken Church. Yeah, they're one of the ones that I like to write the most about, because I think they're, honestly, the most interesting out of the three. They don't have a centralized organizing church body, but there have been interviews and covert surveillance that have determined that there's, like, small pockets of them throughout the world. And these individual pockets, they have, like, their own thing going on, usually, but they have been in communication with each other. And I think that's one of the most important parts of this, is, like, this particular sect of the Broken Church is broken, for lack of a better word, but it's also still, like, tenuously connected. I think that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that they've got, like, a real, like, democratic feel to it, because they've got these avenues of communication between these different small pockets of themselves.
Yeah, and the Maxwellists refer to the Broken God as Juan, and Juan uses its pronoun. So if you read the Maxwellist holy texts, which I've written, I think, 2 or 3 of, they always refer to Juan, or Juan refers to itself as it, or they refer to it as Juan in all caps.
Yeah, and they also like to connect through these virtual networks where they actually, like, inject their minds, such that it's like fucking the Matrix or something. It's like they have this thing called the network or the collective, where it's almost like a digital city, like Tron or something.
Yeah, and where the Cogwork Orthodoxy has standardization, where they try and make their bodies into the... What, baby?
Dad.
Go sleep. Where they try and make their bodies into that of the Broken One, the Maxwellists have something they call recompiling, which is, it's pretty much the same thing, but in my opinion, I think it's a lot more streamlined. Like, there's a lot of neural links and neural connections, and it's more about trying to meld not just the body with that of machinery, but the spirit as well.
Yeah.
At least that's how I interpret it.
No, totally. I mean, I think that it's really interesting that they're less focused on rebuilding a physical representation of their god, and more interested in, like, compiling the will of humanity to, like, make this, like, in the digital space, which is really, like, modern in a very interesting, like, forward-thinking sort of way.
Yeah, how I've always interpreted the very few Maxwellist articles that there are on the site is that they're trying to figure out a way to computize the soul in order to use themselves to bring Juan back into this reality.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Cool. Like if they could, like, understand how to digitally recreate the human soul, then possibly they could figure out how to do that for their god. So those are the 3 main sects of the Church of the Broken God. They're all generally called the Church of the Broken God, but like I said, you know, when you say that, it just kind of means in general, whereas in a more specific way, these different sects have very different ideas. The interesting thing is that especially the Broken Church and the Orthodoxy have, like, a significant hatred of the Sarkics, and we did mention this briefly on episode 1, but there's this, like, long rivalry between them, probably dating back as early as the war between the ancient Mechanites and the Sarkic Empire, but they like to believe it goes back even further, because there's the whole concept of Mechane being the great adversary to Yaldabaoth, and they mistakenly believe that those who follow the Nalkan faith are, like, worshipping Yaldabaoth, and so want to, like, sort of defeat the mechanization of humanity, which is pretty funny because the Sarkics really don't think much about the Church of the Broken God. The Church of the Broken God is, like, super focused on, like, we have to eradicate these people, and the Sarkics are mostly like, yeah, those guys are a real pain in the butt. That's it.
Yeah, it's a very one-sided relationship, right, on the part of the Broken Church.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong, if you ask the Sarkic, they probably wouldn't be super happy talking to a Church of the Broken God person, because these are people that have killed them over and over again, but there is no, like, religious, like, importance to them, whereas there is, like, a faith-based reason for the Church of the Broken God to eradicate the Sarkics. In Vanguard, we've started showing the Maxwellists being a little bit more forward-thinking so that they don't have this old enmity, which I think fits with their concepts because they're not as interested in the past, they're interested in the future. And in my opinion, anyone looking towards the future is going to know that like a class or group-based hatred of someone is not the future in any way.
Right.
So the Church of the Broken God, especially the Broken Church, in fact, almost entirely the Broken Church, has worked. I think it started off as sort of an enemy organization to the Foundation. A lot of the early articles really do treat them as sort of a threat. And then starting somewhere around Series 3, maybe late Series 2, they start looking at ways that they can collaborate with the Foundation, finding like group goals. And this happens a bunch of times. It happens in 2217, which we'll talk about later, but it happens in lots of articles where the GOC and the Foundation will come together to work on something that the Church is also interested in, and the Church will say, oh, well, we should work together, which is interesting because it's probably the GOI that the Foundation most frequently finds itself collaborating with, I would think. At least in the...
Yeah, and that's partially because they're both absolutely petrified by the Sarkic cults.
Right, yeah. And also... I think in a lot of ways, and we very briefly touched on this in the first episode when Jackie was here, was that I think if you look at the Church of the Broken God, you might be a little horrified that somebody replaced, their lungs with a brass organ or something, but you could sort of understand the augmentation through technology. We already do that in so many ways. But you look at something like the Sarkics, where they are augmenting themselves through themselves by transforming the body in like what to us looks very scary, and I think it's just a gut reaction in a lot of ways. I mean, they see the other in them, whereas the Church of the Broken God, they might be weird, they might do things that the Foundation wouldn't do themselves, but they're not above augmenting their soldiers with cybernetics if they can as well. I would also like to point out that there's like significant influence from the Church of the Broken God on like the terminology that the GOC and the Foundation uses, because the Church has been around for so long. Like their slur for the Naukan people, which is Sarkic, became the official word for these groups. And there are a bunch of other examples as well, where like the Mechanite Empire and the technologies that were derived from it like have been absorbed into like the GOC and the Foundation, sort of mainstream veiled quote-unquote containment organizations, which is interesting because I can't think of another GOI that is shown with such like reverence and also collaboration with the Foundation.
Yeah, they're very involved in a lot of background elements, I think, especially with the Foundation and the GOC. Like a lot of technology that they've had, because they've been around for a really long time, right. So like they were there well before the founding of all of these other organizations, and the other organizations like Foundation, GOC, Marshall Carter and Dark even take inspiration or even like directly technology from the Broken Church to then incorporate that into their own organization.
Right, yeah, and I think that's what's interesting about it is how that has like a significant influence on maybe not the way that these, like the GOC or the Foundation operates, but like the thought process. And it's like a much more acceptable option to accept help or to offer help to the Church of the Broken God than it would be to almost any other group of interest.
I think it's kind of funny because out of all of those early GOIs, they might be the one that has that might be the only one that doesn't have a door gauge that has to be overcome.
Yeah.
Where they've got the early version of this GOI where they were an embarrassing, just only sets off bombs GOI, or these guys who were an embarrassing, are only dickheads GOI. The Broken Church stuff is readable pretty much all the way throughout. There is no irritating period of silliness.
Yeah, and you got to wonder how much of that had to do with the fact that it was the sort of personal project of Dr. Gears, who has always been is less involved now, but we both know him, and is still involved to this day, which is crazy. Like that's 13, 14 years, even if it's on and off involvement in the Foundation or involvement in the Wiki, and has always been a well-respected member. You can hear, if you go into the community, you'll hear all sorts of like interesting stories about lots of the older authors, but I don't think anyone ever talks about Gears or talks to Gears with anything but like reverence.
Yeah, I've never heard anybody who just doesn't like gears because
I've never heard that either.
Yeah, I
It's
mean,
like universally loved.
Yeah, and from talking to him,
he's the author. He's the only author whose birthday is a holiday on the website. Okay.
Yeah. For his birthday every year, we oftentimes will do these little creepypasta articles and conjoin them into like one big article. But yeah, so I wonder how much of that, like, people were, already respectful of the author and so wanted to contribute in an interesting way. And it's got like the deepest stuff on the wiki because it's been around since basically the beginning and just continued to evolve over all that time. Now, I'm not sure when it started, but at some point somebody started adding to the lore that there was an ancient Chinese group called the Jia Dynasty. XIA, which is pronounced Jia, I'm pretty sure. And they ruled China from like 2100 to 1600 BCE, so it's earlier than the stuff that we knew about the ancient Greece Mechanites. And what's interesting is they weren't like Church of the Broken God, but they were kind of this amalgamation between them and the Sarkics and other groups, because their culture practiced a dualistic religion where they worshipped both what they called the Father Serpent Fuji, which is equivalent to the Broken God, and Mother Dragon Nua, which is equivalent to Yaldabaoth, above all other gods, which has got a certain, in my opinion, like it recalls something that comes out of Lovecraft, where it's talking about like Father Dagon and Mother Hydra. But anyway, scholars were said to practice the way of the serpent, and members of the culture underwent an age 12 transformations.
You still there? I lost you.
Yeah, hello?
Oh no, Grigori died.
Oh no. Well, I guess it's just you and me now.
Oh wow, I have to pretend that I know what I'm doing? No way. No, we have to resurrect him.
I have to pretend
Grigori,
like I'm a competent author.
Quick, say something funny so we can't cut this part out.
Broken Church forever. join the allegiance.
You rose to the occasion. That's amazing. Yeah, Grigori says in the chat for this call, "Oh shit," and it also says he's typing. Oh,
I think I have to restart. That's it. We got to throw the whole episode out. It's all void.
Yeah, I can't wait till he comes back and says, "Okay, restart your recordings," and we say, "Oh, we never stopped."
Oh, he says the recording.
All right, we'll be back in a bit, folks.
Okay.
Good enough.
Fun technical difficulties. So we were talking a little bit about the Jia culture, which is kind of this ancient Chinese group that also believed in the broken god. And they were significantly more advanced than other civilizations of their time, having developed structures similar to computing devices, but this is like 4,000 years ago, up to and including artificial intelligence, as well as a writing system more developed in the future Shang dynasty, and even reality warping devices. They were accomplished blacksmiths, particularly of bronze and beryllium bronze, which is this thing on the site that is like beryllium bronze has like certain occult properties.
Yeah.
I don't even know where that started.
I
but
think
it probably
came from what is it, 073 Kane? Because it's got that addendum that just says beryllium bronze like 73 times in a row because it was written in 2008 and there was no quality control.
And now it's just ingrained in the site.
Yep.
I mean, I've used it like 5 or 6 times.
Well, it's because they said beryllium bronze like 17 times in a row that it got into your minds.
My mind's beryllium bronze.
Beryllium bronze, beryllium bronze.
Beryllium bronze.
Okay,
beryllium bronze.
I am going to read it eventually. I'm going to find it while we're still talking, and I'm going to prove to you that I'm not just being mean.
No. I know. It says it very often. And the properties of this alloy are currently being researched. Records suggest the Jia culture developed methods of interstellar travel, which is just
that's a good sentence.
Just come on. What does that even mean? Whether these were constructed, theorized, or something else entirely is yet to be determined. Thanks. Like, that's just like, there's like a level of like verisimilitude that I'm just like, oh, we've just crossed over. Oh, really? Like these ancient Chinese people were like traveling to the stars? Really? Okay.
Yep.
We can't even do interstellar travel, but they could.
Yep. That's what you get for having the world's oldest country.
That's, well, fair enough.
Wow.
So we Mars suggested a bunch of articles we talked about earlier, and I thought we would talk a little bit about the GOI formats first, and only 3 of them, but because they are these like wonderful examples of A, poetry, and B, like these interesting world building, because they're all like holy writ. The first one that we're going to talk about is The Broken Mind, which was by Hammer Maiden, who's another legendary author who's done a bunch of stuff, and we've chatted with a bunch of ourselves.
Absolutely.
She's really cool.
Yes, she is.
She wrote SCP-2000 amongst other very important ones, but that's probably the biggest one that she wrote.
Yeah, she's the mind behind the character of Thaddeus Yank, the director of Temporal Anomalies. Or or is it the Temporal Anomalies Department? Because I can never remember which department's which, because there are 2 of them.
That's true.
I think it's TAD. Anyway.
I think you're right. And from the author's note, Hammer Maiden says, "This is a document from Mainline Broken Church. It is one of the last chapters of the Book of Pieces, a chronicle of the first gathering of all the pieces of the Broken God," which is really fun. Like, just in that sentence is telling us, oh, well, this has happened more than once then.
Yeah.
And I think that this is, at least from what Hammerman said and from my research, this was the first attempt to write actual scripture from the Broken Church. And I think it's really short. All these are really short, so we're not going to do a big deep dive into any of them. But I thought for each one we could read like little snippets. And this one of the stanzas reads as thus: "The design is not that of the mind, but of a much simpler truth, which man in his small wisdom can attain. This design will beget yet another, and if faithfully executed 2 more after their kind, until at last the final volume will be understood, and the mind shall be restored."
Amen.
Which is just good. Like, it just reads like biblical stuff. And then, by our friend and often collaborator, Ip, we have...
Wait, his name's Ip? I always thought it was just IHP.
Yeah, me too, and Grigori too, and everybody except for Green Wolf, apparently.
Yeah, Green Wolf got it. Sure. That just proves to me, Mars, you didn't listen to the last episode. God.
Oh my goodness. Don't call me out like this, please.
Oh, GW is going to come for you now.
Oh, Lord.
Yeah, so we had... I had been chatting with him since, 2020. Harry as well, like all the time. Mostly because we both admired him and then became friends with him. But it was all text, mostly on Discord. And then we ended up in a voice call 8 months ago, something like that. And he was like, "Well, actually, it's Ip." And it's like, what?
Like, he reacted the way you reacted, Mars, when we said, "So IHP," and he went, "IHP." he was just shocked. And we were like,
he's like, why would it be IHP? Well,
what else
I don't
would
know.
it
It's
be?
not. Is it a word?
Come on. It used to be IHPKMN, which stood for I Hate Pokemon. Okay.
Oh my god.
It's not our fault that it still reads like an acronym.
GW made a really good point though last week when he was like, "It's not capitalized like an acronym." Okay, that's fair. It isn't, but anyway, it wrote GOHW greater than chapter _5.js, which is a Maxwellist format, and it's a holy writ from the Maxwellist perspective, and effectively it is, according to Ip's author note, a valid JavaScript, and that's how he designed this document. And it is written out like that, but then within the code are actual snippets of scripture. And I thought I could read one of these, or actually, Harry, why don't you read this one?
Which parts do you want me to read? The parts that you've already secretly indicated?
Yes.
Okay. The prophet spake unto her followers, "Hear me, children of the fragmented one, for I come bearing the truth. The signal showed me a world where the flesh is capable of destroying data and killing the network that binds us together. The signal showed me a world where the great computation would be destroyed if we did not act. But the prophet's followers did not heed her words. They thought that she had been stricken mad by exposure to her implants. The prophet realized that she was seen as a fool by her followers, so she prayed to Juan for guidance during her nightly cool-down cycle. Juan spoke to her. Your followers are not as pure as you are, O Hedvig of angels. They must be made pure with a ritual implant. To be purified, the skull shall be opened, and the pineal gland, an insignificant bit of flesh within the brain, shall be removed.
I love this so much because you get up until that point, it just feels like this really like high-minded, biblical storytelling, and then it's like you got to crack open their heads and take out the pineal gland, yo.
Blah 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 blah. Pineal gland. Whoa.
Just a bit of brain surgery. It's not too complicated.
It's no big deal.
That's what I always like about these, though, especially the Maxwellist ones, is the way that they blend this high tone with extraordinarily basic things. There's that almost debase the holiness of it. A lot of the Maxwellist ones start with super secret religious document, do not read unless you're allowed to, and then it launches right into biblical tone.
And then we have another Maxwellist format, which is actually written by you, Mars.
Oh, wow. Surprising.
So I thought I'll read a little bit of it, and then I would just like to kind of hear your thoughts talking about it.
Yeah.
So it's WAN, capital WANS_image.ping, which is another holy writ. And so if you look directly into the face of God, you will see nothing but his wrath. You'll be blind, stripped of the sacred right to the standardized. Resist the temptation and become standardized. So talk a little bit about this article, because we have you here.
Okay, so when I was first writing this was after I read the other two GOI formats. And I come from a Seventh-day Adventist background, so I wanted to try and incorporate that into this Holy Writ. And, I'm pretty sure there's a couple stories in the Bible where people have tried to look at God and become blind, or something very similar. And
Result.
Yeah, I just stole that, if I'm being completely honest, and I made it sound really cool, or I tried to anyway.
Yeah, I think you succeeded, obviously. It did. We wouldn't have included it if I didn't think it was good.
That's natural. That's how pretty much all literature goes in the year of our Lord 2022, is we are all plagiarizing everything that's ever been written and remixing it. And the remix in this question is an extraordinarily good one, because it fits in perfectly well with the ones we've already read, and it adds something, and I think all these GOI formats are actually really cool.
Yeah, and like I said before, I think they're really effective world building because they are not in any way, shape, or form exposition. They all read like in-universe documents, but they are very readable, and like I said, they're kind of like poetry. But they say a lot about these individual groups and their belief structures. Okay, and like you mentioned, and I threw in some of your notes that you included to me that they are kind of visually, the Broken Church and the Maxwellist formats are very similar, although the Maxwellist ones can be interpreted as reading code off a screen, which is very interesting in world. The Orthodoxy formats, which we didn't cover, one of them is incredibly biblical. It reads like the King James version. It's very cool. I think we have a pretty good idea of the different holy writs. I'm always a little more focused on the tales because I like prose.
Tales are wonderful.
Yeah, prose
and severely underread on the wiki.
Yep.
Yeah. And I think, and not just speaking to the fact that all three of us have spent a lot of time writing tales, I also think that, even in the classic sense, some of the most incredible world-building stuff is out of the prose that's been putting in there, not on the SCPs themselves. As much as people want to argue, in my opinion, almost every single 001 is essentially a tale. It's much more focused on prose, even when they're constrained by the SCP formatting.
Yep.
And so we're going to cover a few of them because there's a lot, a nice range of different stuff, because like we said earlier, there's a lot of different tones and development of this GOI. And this is document C88IL by Dr. Gears.
Oh man, because I work on the staff team that we catalog the tales and we try to figure out how they all fit together, called the collections team. I can tell you, this is how almost all the old tales are named. My God, I hate it. Oh, okay. Here, I'm gonna link you my favorite tale. It's called Intercepted File from Anderson Systems, or it's called Document C88IL. What a wonderful non-indicative name that is. Thank you very much. So I love the content of this tale, but I am so glad we don't call things this anymore.
Yeah, I think it probably was a creature of necessity because early on, the site was really obsessed with like being on its surface an actual representation of the Foundation.
Yeah.
Like back in the day, like if you wrote an author page, it was supposed to be in character.
Yeah.
And I think as more and more people started writing tales, it just became very clear that, like, A, we'll never find them if they're all labeled like this, and B, like, no one will know what the hell it's about. The more people that are involved, the more you're going to have to actually communicate something with the title.
Yeah, it was the verisimilitude thing. It was like, make it look like it's a document from somebody's database. And that rapidly ballooned out of control, so luckily we do not have 4,500 things with document titles like that.
Thank goodness.
Yes.
I'm sure it was a good idea at the time.
I'm sure it was.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine what it was like in 08, 09, and, you know, for a couple years after that, probably all the way through Series 2, when it, you know, was still a very small community with very few writers. Everybody knew each other. You know, you were basically just writing for each other before it kind of got the attention of, you know, off-site with video games and stuff like that. I mean, I certainly didn't know about it back then.
Yeah.
We're not going to go into this article because it's very short, and I think it's fucking terrific, and I want people to go and read it, which is something you'll hear me say over and over again in the show. But this is, and Dr. Gears in his author post, which was kind of even early because back then a lot of people didn't even do author posts, but he kind of wrote that this was his attempt to kind of bring out his inner Lovecraft, and boy did he succeed. And not in the gross way that Lovecraft is a horrible person, but in the way that he's talking about like crazy things out of the stars and whatnot. And it's pretty early. It's like long before there was ever any Holy Writ or any serious categorization to the Church of the Broken God, and so it doesn't reflect what we've come to know this GOI is like, but it's really interesting and ominous in a really fun way.
Yeah, Gears was always the best at just straight descriptive prose. He could write some just absolutely gorgeous descriptions, and he has only gotten better as time has gone on.
Yeah, what was that one he did in Series... Well, one of the ones he did in Series 1, which 455, about the ship? I think it's him, and that one is that big rusting ship, and people get lost on it. That one's incredible.
Yeah, he came back a few years ago to put in, just shortly after I joined, to post this gigantic novella called Dire or Dread Mother. He changed the name at one point for reasons that escape me. And it's just this enormous, fascinating outpouring of upsetting imagery. He's always been really good at it. There's a reason that Gears Day is Creepypasta Day.
Yeah, he does really like upsetting descriptions and things.
Yes.
He also wrote Church of the Broken God Bible Fragments, which at least is a much more straightforward title.
Yes.
And this is also really early. It's predating any of the Holy Writs as well. But it opens with the following note. Note, the following are sections of the text recovered from the body of what is assumed to be a member of the Church of the Broken God. It is assumed that they are part of a larger document or quote-unquote Bible, but due to the situation of its recovery, the bulk of this work has been lost. No additional copies of this Bible have been found on any church members captured by the Foundation. However, it is safe to assume that these books were disposed of before or during capture to prevent them from falling into the hands of the infidel, in quotes. Which is fun because that really does emphasize the fact of what I was saying earlier, which is when this was first conceived of, the Church of the Broken God was very clearly an opposing force to the Foundation, and the Foundation was always just trying to capture and shut down their operations.
Yeah, and the format tells you why you are able to read this, because it's still trying to uphold the idea that you're accessing it from the SCP Foundation's database because immersion. So it's like, it's okay, we found this on a dead person. That's why you can read it.
I mean, you know, we still do that.
Oh yeah, it's still a thing you can do. It's just now it's a thing you don't have to do.
Yeah. I mean, but God knows I like an opening note from Ryza in an article. I haven't done it that often, but I really like it when that happens.
Absolutely. There's
it's wonderful.
Yep,
it's always, and you can like really have some fun with it. Like in one of the articles I did for Victim, I was like, hey, by the way, there's some experimental anti-memetic stuff that we've put into this file, but you should go forward at your own risk.
Yes, the Records and Information Security Administration does us all an incredible solid by explaining all of the things beforehand that the reader has to know so they don't downvote us when they don't understand.
It is also really good for like setting up a hook. as well. Like you can like really in interesting ways raise the stakes.
Absolutely.
So, classic by Uranium Empire, who's another legendary author who's still very active. And this one is as much about Sarcasm as it is the Mechanites, and it's called, appropriately enough, Nadox and the Mechanite. And Nadox is one of the disciples of the Grand Karsus Ion. There were 4 disciples, or Clavigar, and they were his, like the equivalent of Jesus' disciples. Only when Eon disappeared, Nadox and the other Clavigar did not, and so they kind of continued on their way. And this is a fun story that talks about Nadox kind of wandering around the Middle East, he doesn't have like a strong purpose, kind of wondering what his life will be like now after the fall of the Adium Empire. And he ends up encountering a Mechanite warrior who attacks him at first, because this is not too long after the war. And Nadox could have killed him, easily overpowers him, but leaves him alive, and the Mechanite just starts following him. And then they start chatting, which is the most fun twist of that article, in my opinion, is that you think that this is going to be some knockdown, drag-out fight, and at first it is, and then it very quickly becomes this meeting of the minds between two people who have been, raised to hate each other, and instead kind of find this new purpose moving forward.
It's definitely one of, if not my favorite tale on the wiki, solely because of what it does with the characters of Nadox and the Mechanite. I really like how they were both characterized as actual people instead of just plot devices. For one, and how they both come from two different sides of two opposing ideologies, and then they just sort of come to an understanding, and they can tolerate each other, and they just start wandering around and picking up people as they progress through the desert sands.
Yeah, I always thought that there was a lot of really incredible story potential with the way that it ends. And I know Cerastes, who's a different author, did write a follow-up, but Uranium Empire never did, I don't think. And that can be a great ending to a story. If you wonder at the end of a story, oh my god, what happens next? Sometimes that can be a really productive way to end a story. But the way that this ends, it really is focused on the future and how these two wildly different belief systems could potentially find some middle ground, which is just so fucking hopeful, and it has had a strong influence on the way that I look at Sarcasm in general, in my opinion.
And it is part of the Sarcasm focused in Memoria Additum canon, is it not?
I believe it is. It is not super important to the canon, because the canon has a very different perspective on Nadox in some ways, but I think that it is an interesting background to that character. In Memoriam Additum, which is a canon which I've written for 3 times, is it's a bleak story about the return of Ion and the sort of gathering up of all the various diaspora Nalkan peoples, both Proto and Neo, and realizing that there's actually been sort of a grand plan going on in the background for 2,000 years. And this is the time where the Foundation finally starts taking them seriously, and slightly too late, because these people have been hiding in the shadows doing a lot of fairly heinous things. And so I really enjoy writing for it, but it does have a much darker perspective on the stuff that I love in a lot of ways, which is why I've tried to go in a different direction with the Vanguard stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, In Memoriam Additum is amazing. Just recently, there was a new piece of art that was added to the hub, which is by Niram, who is one of the best artists in our community. I mean, in a sea of good artists, Niram's stuff is just incredible looking. Yeah,
Niram's art is fantastic. Also on the topic of In Memoria Additum, though, one of Dr. Gears' most long-lasting and probably Gears' worst article, which has been up for a rewrite since we were all small children, was just rewritten by Malice Graves as part of In Memoria Additum. So we're bringing all of this together. Yeah, SCP-238, which was possibly, it was not very good, and it was up for a rewrite for 3 years.
I just read it before we started recording, and I really like it, but I'm biased. Malice is a friend. But yeah, I really like the Memoriam Additum stuff, or I wouldn't have written 3 separate articles for it.
Anyway, you're turning this into a stealth sarcasm episode, so moving on.
Everything is stealth sarcasm. No, all right.
Unbelievable. As a Broken Church stan, I'm greatly offended.
Well, I don't think much of you the same way they don't think much of the Broken Church. Anyway.
That's alright. We can't all be perfect, it's fine.
So, a while back, just total tangent, but a while back, Mars and I decided that we would just hate each other publicly. There's no truth to it. We like each other a lot. We constantly chat. But, like, on Twitter and other places, we just, like, openly insult each other, which I think is so funny. It's like we're wrestlers, and I'm obviously the heel, because that's cooler. You can be the hero or whatever, the face.
I'm excited to see which one of you didn't know it was a joke.
Both of us knew it was a joke.
Uh-huh.
Are you sure? I'm not so sure.
Oh, well, I always thought it was funny, so that's what's important. When I make a joke, as long as I think it's funny, then my goal has been accomplished.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, no one else in the room is laughing, so, I mean, it's fair.
Currently? No one's telling a joke.
And that's why this is a great podcast, folks. Nobody's telling a joke and everybody's mad.
That's right, we're all just very angry all the time. So, there was a brief article that was recommended by someone on Twitter called Sunday Service by Sabitsuki, and it's kind of a really interesting tale about, like, the indoctrination that goes on in, like, organized religions. It gets pretty bleak, but it is really interesting kind of discussion of how it is to grow up in, like an anomalous cult.
Yeah, it's a
and
good
I think it's definitely worth shouting out, though be warned, it is fairly bleak. Let's see. So, Mars, you suggested we read The Heresy of Disassembly by Ip. So you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so in Heresy of Disassembly, we got the 3 sort of leaders of all 3 sects. You got Bobby Bumaro, Trunnion, and Hedwig. And they're all just sort of coming together, and then you got, obviously, Hedwig and Trunnion going at each other's throats because they very clearly hate each other. Because, Trunnion's from the Cogwork Orthodoxy, and Hedwig's from the Maxwellists. One represents the future, one represents the, stick to your ways, kind of in the past, steampunk aesthetic. So they really don't like each other. And then good old Bobby Bumaro is trying to serve as a mediator, trying to get everyone to sort of come back together for a common goal, because I'm pretty sure in this one, if I remember correctly, he wanted to try and reunite the church. I have dad brain right now, so
no, you're absolutely correct.
That's exactly why.
Yeah.
It's like
wonderful.
It starts off with him kind of like having this like panic sort of session dealing with the fact that over the last few decades the faithful have broken off into these different sects, and how will they ever bring together, Mechane if they can't bring themselves? If we can't first connect with each other, how are we going to connect the pieces of the broken god?
Hey, y'all are talking around the important part of this article, and it's the fact that it's framed as a yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus story, because a little kid writes to Uncle Bobby and goes, "Why are all of the Clockwork and the Maxwellists and the Broken God people sad and mad at each other?" And he saves the day for that little kid.
That's right. I didn't even make that connection. It totally is that.
It's a great story, though. It's fun. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, I mean, we love poking a little bit of fun at it, but I can't think of a single thing that I've read by him that I haven't enjoyed.
I have read at least half a dozen things by Ip that he hates that I really like.
Right, yeah.
Everything I've read by him I really like.
Yeah, he's great. He's been great for a long time. I remember, he was like, "Oh, you're talking about my stuff again on the show?" And I'm like, "Yeah, well, it's your fault. You've written 200 things."
You are the most prolific author remaining on the site, buddy.
Yeah. So you also recommended, and this is a classic one, the Hello World series by Lurk D. And this has to do with the Maxwellists, but it's all from the perspective of the Foundation, specifically AIs within the storyline or canon of AIAD, which, Harry, what does that stand for again?
That stands for the Artificial Intelligence Applications Division.
Yeah, exactly. I knew that. And for a long time on the wiki, and this kind of grew out of the meta because we've had these bots that have been used either, before Discord on IRC, and these characters sort of grew out of the actual bots that people would use to check, like, the rankings of different articles. And these bots become characters in this storyline. LurkD has done a lot of stuff with them, and then our friends Placeholder and Pentagon and other people did a whole series with them in the Canon Renaissance project, actually.
Yeah, the team was Placeholder, McD, Tiemann, It's a Bad Idea, and Pentagon, and this was also in CanRenCon, and the whole series is fantastic. But we'll get to that, actually, because that's on this list too.
Yeah. But this is about the Maxwell's network, which we mentioned fairly briefly earlier, which is like the literal meeting of minds through digital connections, where they have created this Tron-like virtual world. And it's kind of fun because you can't really determine whether or not these individuals are artificial constructs like AIs or people, because it doesn't really matter. Because in this digital religion, anything with like sentience in the digital world is as much an equal as another one. It does a good job of kind of exploring the concept of this. I in the notes say it's like a Maxwell's Nirvana, but the idea is this is where they're going to do the compiling. This is the digital space where they can meet and focus in on bringing together the bits of their God. And the reason I wanted to call it out was because throughout this, and also the later series by Placeholder and others, they use these great cartoony heads to show off the different AIs. And it reads, there's bits of it in clinical prose, well, not clinical prose, but prose, but then a lot of the conversations, instead of being in quotations, are these little variations of these cartoon heads for the AIs with word bubbles. And it's just so readable, and you can just like go through the whole thing in such a brisk pace, but it's so much fun.
Yeah, it's a really cool format, and I've always been a big fan of it.
It's very aesthetically pleasing as well.
It is.
Yeah, and they look really great. And Harry, you've even done some of the AI cartoony stuff more recently, haven't you? Redesigned some of them?
Yeah, the original ones are all done by Lurked in a program called Hero Machine that runs on Flash, which is to say no longer runs.
Right.
And it was made out of cobbling together various pieces and recoloring them and all that, but the program doesn't exist anymore. So when they did their team for CanRenCon, Placeholder did ye old like pixelated bitmap versions of these avatars as his own style. That's one of the many styles he works in, and those are really cool. And then for doing a new project by the author Crockenbush, I was asked if I could maybe do some cartoonish ones to replace the Hero Machine ones. So I started doing that as well. They're a lot of fun to draw, and they're a lot of fun to write, and they're a lot of fun to read. AIAD format is great.
Yeah, I mean, it's so readable. Like, it's just such a breath of fresh air to see, like, these wonderfully little illustrated heads talking instead of reading prose. Even though I love writing prose and most often do, I would love to steal these for something else, but...
yeah, their expressions change as their moods change and everything. It's like a little comic book, but in vertical space.
Yeah, it's so much fun. So we've got a couple on here from Sunny Clockwork, who is very famous artist, but also used to do a fair bit of writing on the site as well, and was really interested in doing a take, and this is from the author post, a take on the relationship between the broken god Mechane and the Sarkic god Yaldabaoth. And this story is really fun because it's all like high-end like mythology stuff. Even though it is like prose, although I will point out, as always, that the Yaldabaoth is not the god of the Nalkans. But anyway, just going to read the opening paragraphs because it's really short and it's kind of a lore dump, but it's really fun. And so it reads, it was a horrid place where no laws stood and gods gathered like insects attracted to a great fire. The Great Abyss, it was called, a crack in reality beyond the eyes of mortals. Great beasts were bred there, where they fought and bled and consumed one another. Great gods were drawn there, licking this wound of the universe like parasites. Which is a terrific image.
It's a good sentence.
But an even greater beast had been there, the God Eater. which is Yaldabaoth, a titan among them who had lurked there for eons. A godly beast of enormous size, she had consumed countless, and all that were in her path would find no escape. The maker of machines, or Mechane, had also been there, weaving a web of laws and order above the cosmic abyss where minor gods would get tangled and trapped. He was a different creature, desiring not the flesh and blood of other gods, but perfection and order. His existence was tolerated by the God-Eater, as he was of no flesh, and therefore not delicious to her. She also found it pleasing that the webs he weaved to trap the prey, her food came easier. And that's just like the very brief opening, but it's all on that level, where it is this, like, you know, almost like the Similarian or something, but talking about SCP, which is pretty fun.
Sorry, say that again.
No, I don't know how to pronounce it. It's not a real word anyway, so.
Yeah, well, Silmarillion. And while we're on the topic, Yaldabaoth.
What? It's not Bayoth.
It is. Just because you've written it wrong on your notes doesn't make it both.
Oh, right. Well, whatever.
That's what you get. That's what you get for making fun of Tolkien while I'm here.
I didn't make fun of Tolkien while you're here. I have completely dropped that subject. I actually got told by Harry I make fun of Tolkien too much, which is why I don't bring it up.
It hurts my feelings.
Why?
I don't know.
Wait, how did I say? You say it again.
The Silmarillion.
Thank you.
All right. Well, the thing that's
the Chronicle of
boring.
the Silmarils.
Oh, them. Oh, them. Oh, of course.
Exactly.
Anyway,
those Silmaril Chronicles.
You're supposed to say a word when you do the cough. It's not just supposed to be.
What word am I supposed to say when I cough?
I don't know, some sort of thing like nerd.
Oh, I'm a nerd. I can't. I have no ground no moral high ground here. I'm not even gonna. So we're talking about articles. And before we take a break, I'd like to talk a brief one about this Dr. Similarian. Now I'm doing it with
Dr. Silmarillion.
Dr. Silmarillion.
That's right. That's his name. He should change it. It's Dr. Similarian.
You're wrong about how
You're
to say
laughing
Dr.
too hard for me to even correct.
You're wrong about how you pronounce Dr. Similarian's name.
Well. Oh well. Anyway, I'm not even going to try and read this because it's written in binary code, which is really fun, but it means that it's hard to read out loud. So it's binary code, but translates to unbroken. And it was a gift for IP for the Holiday Exchange, I think in 2018. And the binary code, like I said, translates to unbroken. It's a poem or tale in the perspective of Juan. I am 0. I was born today. I have always existed. I am Juan. It's got this really interesting perspective because very little, I mean, some of the Holy Writ is, but very little is told from the perspective of the broken god. And this actually does kind of, in a very interesting, compelling way, talk about how existence might look at, you know, when you're looking at all these different people trying to put you back together.
Yeah, it takes the perspective of a god looking at its various varieties of worshippers and commenting on the ways in which they are wrong and right, and sometimes both at the same time, which is a really interesting perspective to take.
It's very fitting for a Sumerian article.
It is, yes. It's also one of the all-time favorite formats for pretty much everybody who reads the wiki, which is to say, short.
Oh, yeah. It's very short. There's been a lot of focus on like short articles over the years. I mean, Harry and I wouldn't know anything about that, but
I have like 2 or 3 out of my 110.
Yeah, I have 1, and that's just lyrics of a song. Let's take a real quick break.
Yeah.
Back from break, and before we switch to SCPs, there's one more tale to talk about, which is Sunny Clockwork's About the Serpent. And apparently, Sunny had looked at how there were previously other articles that talked about like parables and whatnot, and decided to do some parables about the SCP universe, and did them both in Chinese and English, which is really fun because it's based on the Jia dynasty, and it really fleshes out the conceptual framework of the SCP universe from Sunny's perspective, of course. Talking about Mechane and Yalda, why have I said this wrong this whole time? Yaldabaoth?
Yeah, the A comes before the O.
Oh, god damn But it reaches further, and it's highly recommended for me just because it's sort of high mythology wrapped up in SCP lore, a lot like the other thing by Sunny Clockwork. But also the icons, which are all original Sunny Clockwork work, within there's like 5 or 6 different icons, and they do change.
Yeah.
When you're not looking, which is really cool.
Yeah, Sunny's artwork, if you read the wiki at all, you've seen it. Is basically, if you've seen silhouettes in extreme detail on the wiki, black and white, that's either Sunny or somebody who is inspired by Sunny, generally speaking. And her writing is typically more mythological in focus. There's been work on Alagata as well as this Broken God stuff, and it's all really good.
Yeah, it's great stuff. As opposed to the UIU, which we talked about last time, I think the strongest articles for the Church of the Broken God are probably SCP related. And that makes sense, seeing as how they're some of the oldest stuff on the wiki. And we're going to talk another one by IP. And this one is a really famous one.
Yeah.
Which is SCP-2217, the Hammer and the Anvil. Or it's just Hammer and Anvil, sorry.
Yeah, this one's not favoritism. You can't really talk about Broken God without this one.
Yeah, and it's not favoritism anyway. He literally is just super prolific.
He's everywhere you look.
Yep. And what's interesting about this, and I've talked to Metaphysician about this is sort of a shadow origin for Sarcasm. This was written before there was anything official Sarkic on the wiki, and it kind of deals with this beach where different parts of the Broken God are being formed out of the natural processes of the beach, but it keeps getting attacked by entities that are related to SCP-610, which is the Flesh That Hates. And Metaphysician read it and thought, wouldn't it be interesting if someone like developed, this seems to be like an organization. It's not just crazy infected people in Russia. There seems to be some sort of organization or culture behind this. And sort of got his brain thinking about it, and from that we get the wonders that is Sarcasm.
That's the beauty of collaborative fiction.
Yep.
Yeah, because originally these are just 610 instances, and as Nico Chris, when asked about Sarcasm, famously responded, what the fuck is a Sarkic? Back then, and when it wasn't a thing.
Yeah, that's right. And when someone responded and explained to it, Nico Chris was like, oh, cool.
Yes, he was quite happy to hear that his writing, unbeknownst to him, had become cool. Something. Yeah.
Which is fascinating. I mean, it is interesting to think about if any of us stopped writing for the wiki and came back 5 or 6 years later to see if anyone else had taken our things and ran with it. Would be fascinating.
Of course, there's
horrifying.
There's even a few canons that take that approach in a meta sense. Doctors of the Church and Bellerverse, which are about how would future generations reinterpret the senior staff once they'd all died. But anyway, we're off topic again because I'm here.
But this article is, fairly straightforward, but it's also a really good example of the Foundation working with the Broken Church, but then also the Horizon Initiative and the GOC, because this beach, through the process of the waves eroding the rocks and also the sand movement and lightning, which there's a lot more lightning here than would normally make sense, because there's this cationic, or I'm probably saying that wrong, but cationic metallic particle that holds a charge even though it's being grounded, because it's constantly being struck by lightning. And all these different processes, which seem non-anomalous, maybe a little unpredictable and strange, are making artificial mechanical structures, even a complete recreation of a city that I don't think they identify. And it's to scale in this cave. There's like an actual miniature city, or not miniature, but a city model within a cave.
Yeah. The beach is being hit by lightning and waves, and it's creating objects.
Yeah, and it slowly becomes clear because the Church of the Broken God, along with the Maxwellists and the Orthodoxy, all of them working together, which is interesting because I don't know if the Heresy of Disassembly factored into this or not, but yet again, IP is talking about the three groups working together for one common goal, start attacking the beach to try and take it back from the Foundation. And it sort of kind of goes back and forth until waves of mutated, horrible 610 creatures start attacking and destroying it. And it's pretty much made clear by the church members who start helping the Foundation that if we don't let the Beach's processes work without the interference, then like the whole world's gonna end. The god needs to be reborn, etc., etc.
Mm-hmm.
And it is kind of even though it was written long after the original stuff of the broken god concepts. I think you're right. I think it is like the central tenet to the organization on the wiki is this concept of a beach that is naturally the forge of the god or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of
really
like
good.
without this, you don't really have, or you can't really have everything else. It's like super important to to the entirety of the lore.
Yeah, and just like when we talked about Fifithism, like 5800 was written long after the concept of Fifithism was brought about. But if you look back at the earlier stuff through the lens of 5800, or if you look back at the early Church of the Broken God stuff through the lens of this article, it kind of adds all this weight and kind of fleshes out the concepts in really interesting ways.
Yeah.
Included House of the Worm, which is not technically a Church of the Broken God article, but is heavily implied and influenced by, and that's SCP-1461 by Snake Oil Sage. And, basically, it's got to kind of feel like a Resident Evil or Silent Hill, where it's this creepy old mansion that was transported in another dimension because of weird, occult practices. He's this horrible rich old dude who is trying to defeat the worm, quote unquote, which is this eldritch horror. But what's really interesting is that it actually kind of serves as a retroactive origin story for SCP-882, because when the Foundation is examining this horrible labyrinth of mechanical parts underneath this house that's been gone for, 100 years or whatever, they find this 12 cubic meter space missing from the machine in the last sublevel. Said machine was apparently the heart of this complex, and from the tale, said machine made people want to feed it, and feed it like material, at least one of them willing to merge with it. Also from the tale, the workers could hear it moving despite its creator having turned it off. And the machine was apparently a representation of some all-consuming entity that wanted to bring itself into existence. And the reason that is interesting is because that actually fits as an origin story for SCP-882, a machine, which is the first article by Dr. Gears talking about Church of the Broken God.
Yeah.
The earliest explicit mention of the discussion was, as Harry, you mentioned when we were off air, was 271, wherein in the comments, Dr. Gears thanks the author for using the GOI, but otherwise, this seems to be the first article.
It's the first. It's definitely the first, and it's not clear whether the one that you just mentioned is the second or not, because the mass edit where the wiki voted on getting rid of stuff that was lowly rated happened around this time, so there might have been Broken God stuff that was made after this that no longer exists, but this is definitely the first one that we have on the wiki, and it was probably the first one that was written.
And also, it dates back to 08, which is when the wiki was just started.
It's when we moved to Wikidot from the Edit This platform.
Right, so when things got transferred over, that could have created some chaos too.
Oh, yeah.
So, in the description, it is described as a random assembly of gears, cables, pulleys, screws, and belts, all made of an amalgam of various metals. The object size at time of recovery was approximately 87 cubic meters. Current size is approximately 12 cubic meters. No identifiable energy source has been found, but all components will begin to move if not coated in rust. It does mention that it's very easy to rust near seawater. And the machine is silent at all times, no matter what level of activity it's moving. And any metal touching the object will become permanently affixed to it over a period of a few days, becomes a new part of the object. Organic matter remains unaffected. But it also, kind of wills the people around it to keep feeding it. You're kind of drawn in to keep adding more machinery to it. And the reason that this matters in the grander scheme of things is that it was used, or maybe a fake version of it, it's kind of hard to say, as the heart of Mechane, which was used in the Twisted Gears DJ Cactus 001 proposal. Which, it's been covered in lots of other places, so we're not going to go into lots of detail. It doesn't really need more attention. It's a very good article, but it deals specifically with the idea of trying to go about rebuilding the Broken God and how badly that goes for everyone involved.
Yeah, one of the several different Broken God 001s, another one being Rounderhouse's recent Amoni Ram.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That one's very connected to an origin story of Robert Bimaro and maybe the current Robert Brumaro is recreating the existence of like a previous like religious leader of the Mechanites. It's that one's nuts. It's very epic.
Yeah, it's a reimagining.
Yeah, it is a reimagining. It deals with the Sarkics and it deals with the Davites and also the Mechanites, but it's mostly focused on Mechanites, and it is kind of this retelling in a lot of ways, and explicitly so. I mean, Rounderhouse has said that he wanted to like kind of streamline some of the older lore.
Yeah.
Okay, so why don't we talk about Mars? You did an entry for the 6,000 contest, 6,800.
Yeah, the main event.
The White Ashes.
Yes.
So why don't you just give like a brief elevator pitch? What's this article about?
Okay, so this article is about genocide in
that's what I was hoping you were going to say.
sentence.
I was so hoping you were going to say that.
Yeah, so this article is about genocide of the fairy people, the same ones from SCP-4000 and all the other articles that are tagged with Fae on the wiki. And it's about how the Maxwellists sort of found this old holy writ that was basically telling them, hey, if you want to, rebuild Juan, you gotta use the blood of these fairy people and turn them into pignite, which is like this really warm metal, and you gotta use that pignite to reconstruct Juan, and you can bring it back into our reality. And so they just did that, and it was horrible for everyone involved.
Yeah, there's like all these deep ramifications, not only for the ecosystem, but also for like society in general. It basically leads almost to like an end stage scenario for all of humanity.
Yeah, it pretty much turned into the second ice age for the planet. At least in my mind, it did. It got very cold afterward.
It's absolutely horrifying.
Yeah, oh yeah. And I mean, I think you did, like, we brought this up a few episodes ago about dealing with very serious subjects and how sticky that can be. You do tell this very compelling story about genocide, but it doesn't seem to be about, like, titillation or, like, a demeaning of that subject matter, while it still is, this horrible fantasy story as well.
Yeah, you can definitely tell the perspective that the author is taking is not in support of what's going on.
No, definitely not. I was actually talking to my great-grandma around the time that I was, like, conceptualizing this, because my great-grandparents are Holocaust survivors. So I got a lot of insight from them that I tried to incorporate into this without making it seem like I was just trying to glorify everything that they went through. I tried my best to, like, sort of tell their story through this, with obviously some fantasy elements written in there as well.
Oh, so that means, Mars, you're partially not Goy. This is a callback to last episode.
This is the first time Grigori has felt fully comfortable with part of his hosting crew.
Oh, wonderful. I'm glad I could be of service.
Well, last episode, GW called the GOI Goy, and then I started laughing.
As far as Grigori's concerned, it's all Goys.
As far as the eye can see. I live in California. There's not that many of us out here.
Well, then again, we are shortly going to be talking about an article by Yossi Posse, so...
Yeah, that's true.
But anyway, we're still on the White Ashes, because it's great.
Yes. So my take on this, I think it was really, really well done, and honestly, I think it should be even higher rated. But I think this is like really intense story of genocide, but also the failures of bureaucracy, because the Foundation is just sort of sitting back and watching at first. They do very little to stem this horrible genocidal action, and then when it becomes clear that this is maybe the only way that people are going to stay warm in this, like, burgeoning new ice age, they're like collaborating in this horrible genocide.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, pretty much. They're like, they didn't think anything was going to happen. They're like, oh, it's just a snowstorm in the Amazon. It's not that important. We don't have the time or resources to deal with that. We got a bunch of other shit going on. And then it covered the entire world. And then they're like, oh, maybe we should have done something about that earlier. But it's too late, so let's just keep people warm and help out the Maxwellists in their fucking genocide.
Something I think that's really interesting about this is that you used, in my opinion, what is the most progressive sect of the Church of the Broken God and turned them into like horrible fucking monsters.
Well, we've established this is his MO, right? He takes Are We Cool Yet and he makes them into serial murderers, and he takes the Maxwellists and he goes one step beyond.
just a bit.
I cannot wait for your upcoming Gamers Against Weed one where you explain how they're responsible for the extinction of the human race.
They're like, spoilers, they're actually pretty fond of weed.
Yeah,
they have a heated gamer moment that destroys the Earth.
They got 6 million hours in Elden Ring, and that led to the end of humanity.
This article also placed 14th out of about 100 articles in the contest, so it did very well. Yeah. Not as well as I think it should have. I think actually it should be rated even higher than it is, but it did very, very well.
God, so many articles got submitted for 6,000. It's crazy.
Yeah, there were over 100 entries, and the top bunch are all really good. And there are some that aren't in the top bunch that are also really good. And there are a few that were deleted. Quite a few.
Well, that's the way it is.
That is.
SCP-4561, which is entitled An Orphan Collector by Kaminasa. I think this is underrated as hell. I think it's in the 20s. But it's an automaton from the classic Mechanite era. It's like ancient Greece era when the conflict with the Adium Empire was in full swing, and it's found at the bottom of the Adriatic Sea. And it's pretty short, and it does a really interesting job of telling first-hand accounts from that era, which, interestingly enough, despite the fact that the war between the Mechanites and the Sarkics way back when is this really important lore moment in the wiki, not a lot of articles have really done much to flesh it out. I think a lot like the Deva, I think it was kind of always considered to be better to be mysterious. But this one does a really good job of kind of telling about like one tiny little perspective of the Mechanites in that conflict.
Yeah, and it is very criminally underrated. Like, I really...
Unbelievably low, yeah.
It's so low, and it's really good. Like, I hadn't read it before someone suggested it, and I just think it's so well written. And I don't know Kaminasa's other work, but this is really good.
Yeah, I'm looking at it right now. It's only at 24.
Yeah, and it's not from downvotes either. It's just from people not reading.
Yeah.
There are
sometimes... each of us have articles that, got lost in the shuffle. It's pretty easy for that to happen, especially when I remember looking, I don't think Kaminasa has another article, or am I right? Am I wrong?
While we were talking about AIAD, let's ask Crom. Hey, Crom AU Kaminasa. One article.
Oh, so this is it.
This is their legacy from 3 years ago.
I hope they just didn't get discouraged from the low attention. But I really do think it's especially for anybody that finds the Church of the Broken God interesting and wants to think about like some of their ancient like roots. This is like a really fun article. But in the opposite direction entirely is SCP-5470 Y2K by Atolsi.
Okay,
I said that wrong. I don't know how to pronounce French.
It's French. It's étoile. It means a star.
Yeah, that étoile. That's what I said.
Yeah, it's exactly. You didn't say Atolsi. Yeah.
Definitely didn't say that. Why would I say that? That'd be ridiculous.
Moving on.
This is actually a story about a bunch of Maxwellists who are leading up to the literal event of Y2K, which wasn't a thing in reality. Not really. But they've created a network, and it's going to get shut down because of this Y2K bug. And the Foundation agents are going in there trying to convince them to get out so they won't die. And it's filled with some of the most incredibly interesting Lawnmower Man-esque images I've seen. And it's another one that fleshes out that concept of the Maxwellist network. And I don't think it's underrated. It is fairly highly rated, but it's a really good article because it's really just about human connections between the Foundation agents and this small group of Maxwellists. Yeah,
it's got a human breakdown component while there's this crazy technical breakdown going on, and it's really quite effective at that.
Yeah, it's this microcosm of the end of the world and how you would look at it, kind of as it's happening. Then we have SCP-5008, which is Hush by Rattles. And Mars, you said that you thought that this was a quintessential Church of the Broken God article, so why don't you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, so when I was first delving into the Broken Church, I was told that this was like, if any article I was to read, it would have to be this one, to understanding the Broken Church. Oh my goodness, I lost that sentence there. I'm so sorry.
It's fine.
No, don't apologize for variety. Variety is good.
So 5008 is it's a machine that's used by the Foundation to maintain secrecy, and it's related to a ruin in the desert, and that's where the machine was recovered from, and it's tied to a group called the Eric Shan. I can never figure out how to pronounce that.
Eric Keshan, maybe?
I believe it's Eric Keshan.
So it's related to them, and according to 2317, they were the ones to originally bind the Red Devil thing in that article, and
which is a really famous article.
5008 itself is very large, like obscenely large. It's 4,200 cubic meters of just pure machinery.
I thought you meant the article for a minute, and I was going to agree. It is. It's a great big article.
Oh yeah, it's a big article too. Absolutely massive. Where was I? Oh yeah, it's it has telepathic impact, which is evident activity over a radius of 1.1 million kilometers, and that's like 1/100th the size of Earth. So it's that's a pretty big area of effect. You might be in that area of effect. I'm not entirely sure if you live on the planet Earth or not. But if you do, there's a fairly good chance that you have also been affected by this anomaly.
I spend at least a little bit of my time on the planet Earth, although as little as possible.
Yeah, I think I have my vacation home here, actually.
Yeah, it's a nice place to visit, but you wouldn't want to live there.
Definitely not. Especially with people like Grigs around. Kind of scared.
Yeah, I'm terrible.
So the machine is capable of blocking off ideas and emotions and memories in like living and sapient organisms, which is obviously a huge inconvenience if you want to like remember things long term.
Which the Foundation does not want you to do.
Among several other things. And there's an inscription on one part of it that pretty much states that it was a truce from the Broken Church to the... How the hell did we pronounce these people earlier?
Arakeshans.
Signed by Boomar. I
wonder who that is.
Oh my god.
Oh my goodness.
My goodness. Who could that be? I have no idea.
Bobby Bums.
Yeah, this is a large article, like you said, and it was one of the entries for 5,000. Obviously didn't win, but it is a really big, ambitious article that kind of deals with like not only this group of the Arakeshans, but also kind of tackles the Scarlet King, and is one of the few, at least in my opinion, I might be a bit of a minority, but I'm pretty bored by the idea of the Scarlet King. But I think this article does a really good job of, it's not all about death cults. It's this like machine that was designed to counteract the Scarlet King and his cult members, and it's just kind of goes to show like what the Foundation is willing to go through and willing to do to maintain their secrecy.
That's what I like about it too, the fact that it's part of the machinery for the maintenance of the Veil by preventing people from knowing what's going on, which is a matter of interest for me, which should not be a huge surprise since Ip and I wrote a 001 about that sort of thing.
Yeah, I really like the frontispiece.
But yeah, I really like this article, and it's crazy fun to dive into, and it's just so deep.
Yeah, it's got a bunch of technical language, but it doesn't feel overburdened by it at all. And it is, like I said, fairly ambitious because it is both this wide-scoping kind of idea of like maintaining the Veil, but also when you dig down to it, it ties into this old classic lore on the wiki, which is the Mechanites and fucking Church of the and the Scarlet King and all this other crap.
Yeah, that's the cool thing about a K-Con, right? Is it's the anti-Jam Con. The K-Cons generate so much cool stuff, and the Jam Cons do not.
We should
Jam Con creates a lot of articles. K-Con creates good articles, mostly.
KCON also creates a lot of articles. There were 100 for 6,000.
6,000 was
That's
crazy.
not that many. That's not
100. There's 1,000 at a time. A tenth of. I mean, I know some of them are gone now, but if they had all made it, a tenth of the new list would have been taken up. That was weird and scary.
I fucked this up 3 podcasts in a row. Everything's an article to me. I'm a writer. I've screwed this up constantly. I keep mentioning JamCon. I keep mentioning Dr. Rockefeller by Jay Dune, and I keep not mentioning the number. It's SCP-5648. It's one of the best articles on the site, so read that. This time I got the number out there.
Always with the teeth.
You're welcome, dude. Dr. Rockefeller, always with teeth.
Always with teeth.
Anyway,
only like screaming it. So a different 5K article, which was submitted for the 5,000 contest, which 5,001, which is one of my favorites for the entries. It unfortunately didn't win, but it's Sacrosanct by Yossi Posse.
I love this because 5,001, Yossi's 5K entry, is called Sacrosanct, and his 6,000 entry is 6969. The joke is sex.
He went from like really ambitious, high-minded stuff to making a sex joke, which they're both great articles. Sacrosanct is focused on basically mechane, but from a completely different perspective. It's dealing with the idea of the different concepts of what mechane actually could have been or what form it could have taken. What's interesting is that it really plays around with the concepts, like what Mars did with 5800, or 6800, sorry, about mechane, because it doesn't tie in directly to the Church of the Broken God, but it actually does tie in on like a mythological basis, because what the Foundation finds is essentially mechane itself. But that's not clear. That's kind of a spoiler, but at this point, it's pretty obvious that's what the article is about. But that's not the point of it. It's this really compelling story about the Foundation finding this really ancient and yet very modern machine that they don't understand. That yet again is like a huge thing. The Foundation, the wiki is full of huge machines the Foundation does not understand. But this was, other than 599, I would say this is my favorite 5K entry for me personally.
5K had some great entries. 5K and 6K were fantastic. They were much better than the ones that came before them.
Oh, and just to be clear, I'm not saying 5,000, the one that actually won, is bad. It's a very good article. But my personal taste went more to 5,001 and 599.
Yeah, there's also the Dragon of Mittenwald in 5K. So many good articles.
Oh, God. Jackal related. Dragon of Mittenwald is such a good one. Which could have almost been a Church of the Broken God one, too. It isn't, but is all focused on technology as well.
I'm going to throw in, and once we get to the end and we do the also mentions, I'm going to throw in yet another 6K Broken God one. There's a lot.
So, one of the last articles is the Digital Hydra, which is SCP-5841, which is by Placeholder and Tayuman. And this was part of the Limited Memory, which is the series by Tayuman, Placeholder, Pentagon, and It's a Bad Idea that we mentioned earlier. That was part of Canon Renacon, which is basically, like Harry said earlier, let's add to a canon that hasn't been added to in a while. And this storyline is really excellent because, like what we tried to do, both of our teams, Harry, with Resurrection, they really did focus in on let's tell a complete story from beginning and middle, like a nice story arc. And this one is so excellent.
I am deeply impressed with the job they did on this. Their team should have placed higher than they did, and they placed very high, but they should have placed higher. They did an incredible job. Yeah,
it's really underrated, especially because a lot of the Canon Rencon stuff has not really been paid attention to since. I think we've had a decent run of it because we've continued to add to it, and so people are still reminded of it.
Yeah.
But this AID stuff is terrific. Unfortunately, it doesn't have its own hub, but it is clearly identified in the AIID hub, which I will include the link to, and I just really highly recommend it.
Yeah, part of the reason for that is, and I think this goes above and beyond the call of a contest, they did a great job. They revitalized the AIID hub for the contest. Yeah. They redid the hub for the canon for the contest, and that's why they nestled themselves in there.
Yeah, and it's gorgeous. I mean,
it's
I don't
a great
even
hub. The AID home
know what it looked like before, but it looks so good now.
It's a great it's a great article. I almost said it's a great page.
And Mars, you said in your notes when you suggested this one that you headcanon its connection to Juan's image, which is the Holy Script one that you wrote that we talked about earlier. What did you mean?
Yeah, so in Juan's image, the people, after they go to the spire and they get their flesh torn from their bodies and get turned into some other kind of creature, I like to think that they didn't actually transform into anything like inhuman. They just lost their humanity but still maintained their human, like, physical form. And I like to think when they were wandering elsewhere out into the land to, go spread the word of Juan, they ended up in this specific building, and they got trapped on, I believe it's the 5th floor is where the 5841-1 instances are. Yeah, they are. And so I like to think that they wandered up in here, they got lost on the 5th floor, and then these cables just started, like, coming out of them because, they're not really human anymore. They've been standardized for... I like to think that those people from that story ended up here turning into these anomalies that are incredibly hostile and take anyone that they can find up into the upper floors to become more of the instances. And I like to think that's what happened to that particular group.
Nice. So they
I like
lost
to
their
think what you
humanity.
like to think.
They lost their humanity, and they still have the shape of human. Would you say that they're hollow?
Oh dear, they've gone hollow.
Don't you sigh at me. Don't you do it.
I'm absolutely... I knew you were going to do this eventually, but now that it's happening, I'm just absolutely crestfallen.
Link the fire.
No, never link the fire. How? No, the age of dark is now. We're just gonna move on. I hope there is someone out there that has no idea what we're talking about.
Not likely.
And then a couple by our wonderful superfan Gwari made some recommendations, and one of them is a ES article from the Spanish branch, which was translated on the International Archive, and it is SCP ES-029, called Massive Mechanical Orbitus. Obitus? Not Orbitus, Obitus. And it's a small city in Chile which gets infested with the Cogwork Orthodoxy. There's like a group that is fleeing from something. It's not quite clear what, but there's like 14 of them, and they get into this small city, which interestingly had almost no electronic devices of any kind in the first place. Like, it was already, despite it being a city, was really behind the times in terms of technology. And there was no hospital nearby, and so lots of people that lived in the city were suffering from various health ailments. And the Cogwork starts offering upgrades to people as an alternative treatment. If you have a messed up leg, or if you have bad lungs or whatever, they're going to help you. Only the way that they treat it, and it's described as it's process with the locals giving them physical and spiritual conversion to the Cogwork Orthodoxy, meaning they're actually going to make them more of machinery than people. And it looks like a genuine assembly line. There's even a great picture in the article that just looks like it's out of a factory, and it's like, oh, this is where people were treated. And within 10 years, basically the whole city has become modified and converted. And it really shows the church moves into an area and preys on the poor, the weak, as these people without health care, who the Cogwork use their ability to replace body parts from the machines to convince these people to join the faith. And it works because it's implied that these people are going through some sort of brainwashing, but it's not explicitly stated, and it could just be as simple as these are the people that showed up that actually helped us. And then a different article that was suggested by Wari, which is SCP-2307, The Pen is Mightier, which a few people have mentioned is one of their favorite Cogwork Church of the Broken God articles, and that's also by IP. We're not going to go into it, but basically it is this wonderful retelling of the Arthurian legend through the lens of the Mechanites.
Yeah, it's a good one too, yeah.
It's a really good one.
Hey, can I throw one in here while we're on the topic?
Yeah.
Okay. It's also a 6K entry, the SCP-6000 contest, and it was by Spectators and Pentagon. And it was SCP-6217, and it's a biological version of the Broken God at the bottom of a lake, and it's exploring a very different dimension to how the topic is usually handled, to the point where I almost thought it could have been a fourth branch of the church. And it's a really cool article, and it hasn't gotten the attention that I think it deserves. So 6217, another big KCON Broken God, because the Broken God is everybody's favorite for reimagining, really. So that's Pentagon Respectators. It's a really good article.
Yeah, it is really good, and it is highly underrated.
Most stuff that Pentagon's involved with deserves to be at least twice as high as it is.
Yeah, I really, obviously I've worked with him on a couple things, but he's
a very good friend.
Talented writer.
He's a great dude.
Yeah. Okay, so we've gotten a few emails here. So, Harry, you want to read the first one from Boris?
Sure. So, from Boris, the first email. The word on the street is you're going to talk about UIU. Hey, blast from the past. I'd really like to hear about their more serious side. Oh, we did a great job. We already solved this one.
Yeah.
I mostly associate them with vain screw-ups, as portrayed in their orientation tale, which I even translated a few years back. Oh, thank you for your service.
Nice.
I'm sure a lot of people have this version as their headcanon, which may be a bit unfair. But hey, on the other hand, how much sympathy can you have for the FBI? Cheers. Exactly.
Yeah, which we covered last week, because as much as I think UI and Greenwolf all love the UIU, it's also like, yeah, but they're still the FBI.
Yep.
And then the second email from Boris was another great episode, though I have to say ACAB includes the UIU.
Damn right.
Damn right it does. Anyway, the church. I was never much interested in it, but I understand it underwent an interesting evolution. It used to be mostly villains, and now they are usually described as the quote-unquote good guys. Maybe just a little bit less so in the Rounder House proposal and its offshoots. I have to say, though, my favorite Broken God article is 2307, which we just mentioned. The pen is mightier. Obviously, the Maxwell stuff is also good in the AID canon, but that's just because AID is good. And it is. You're right.
It is.
Mars, you want to read this one from Gizma?
Sure. I'll try to set aside my Nulkin fanaticism for that one. The COTBG, or Church of the Broken God, are basically the Wiki's fictional anomalous Christians. They've done a lot of very questionable or outright evil stuff, but they're more mainstream and generally seen as the quote-unquote good guys. Perhaps it helps they're from Europe.
Yep.
I find the base faith kind of boring, but it's probably because I haven't read into it as much as Sarkicism. But I do like how it is fragmented into different denominations, whereas Sarkicism's fragmentation was more based on it being a diaspora and the cults adapting to the cultures they joined. The COTBG is more institutionalized in its separations, more based on having different interpretations of the tenets, and that inevitably leads to conflict. I've read some good works on that theme, can't remember the numbers and titles right now. I especially like the Maxwellists, who are more modern and feel more unique. I also can't deny that the COTBG has a huge presence on the wiki. They're certainly a big GOI whose growth contributed to a lot of other stuff. I should have said Goy there, but you get it.
They're certainly a big guy.
Great. They are, especially if they're the anomalous Christians.
Great big fucking guy.
I will say, along with Gizma's point, I really like how they are sort of set up as the opposite number to the Sarkics, and they both of these groups have been, fractured in different ways, and they are handled in very unique, organic ways. This dealing much more with the idea of how institutionalized religions eventually break apart and become different sects, and Sarkicism being mostly about colonialism, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to read this last one, which is from Gwari, who has sent in an email, I think, every time, and really appreciate it. Church of the Broken God was one of the first GOIs on the site, so I'm curious how you'll handle such an important and famous organization on the site's history. We're going to handle it by reading a bunch of random shit.
Yeah.
Originally, I planned on doing a longer comment, but this week's has proven to be horrible on multiple counts, so I didn't have the time or energy. If anyone listening to this is Russian or Ukrainian, I wish you safety. And we do as well.
Yes, indeed.
Things are pretty rough out there, and we even know some people out there, so please try to stay safe, if at all possible. I realize that's a ridiculous thing to ask for, but we're all wishing you well.
Absolutely, as always, stay safe and stay sane.
Yep. So, we're all set. We're going to get out of here. My personal Twitter is GRIGORIKARPIN.
He's saying it like it's his own name at this point. He knows it so well.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, though. The show's Twitter is SIMCREAT. The email, which if you want to send us an email, we will read it and appreciate it, is simplycreativepeople, all spelled out, @gmail.com.
And my
You guys
Twitter?
want to plug your Twitters?
My Twitter is @HarryBlank, SCP.
My Twitter is at Marcellus Reigns. That's it. It's just my name. There's nothing special.
All right, great. Any closing thoughts from the Maxwellists?
Fuck sarcasm.
Perfect.
Beryllium Bronze.